Have you ever felt pressure without anyone saying a word to you? The kind of pressure that lives in the pauses between conversations, in the way people avoid certain topics, in the expectations you sense but are never openly given. It's a quiet weight one that doesn't shout, but slowly reshapes how you see yourself and the people you love. This story begins in that silence. At a family gathering meant to feel ordinary, a father sits at the head of the room, listening more than he speaks. His hair has begun to gray. His posture carries the fatigue of someone who has spent a lifetime building something meant to last. He has one son, Tabuchi, and as retirement approaches, the question that keeps him awake at night is not about money or status, but continuity. What will remain after him? Who will carry forward the meaning he has attached to his life's work? Tabuchi, sitting across from him, feels that question long before it is ever asked aloud. He is not careless. He is not indifferent. He is a man who wants to do right by the people who raised him. But responsibility, when mixed with expectation, can quietly become something heavier than love, especially when circumstances refuse to cooperate. Tabuchi's wife, Riho, notices these shifts before anyone else. She notices how conversations change tone when the future is mentioned, how smiles linger just a second too long, how the word someday begins to feel like a deadline instead of a hope. Riho loves her husband deeply. Their marriage is built on gentleness, mutual respect, and the unspoken promise to protect one another. Yet even in that closeness, she begins to feel alone with a question she never asked to carry. This is not a story about cruelty or blame. No one here intends to hurt anyone. The father loves his son. Tabuchi loves his wife. Riho respects the family she married into. And yet, something subtle begins to shift. Because expectations passed down through generations rarely arrive as demands. They arrive as inheritances of belief about duty, about worth, about what it means to be enough. In this space, pressure does not announce itself. It grows quietly, filling the emotional air of the household. It settles into glances, into silences, into thoughts no one feels permitted to voice. And slowly, what was once a shared life begins to feel like something that must be justified. This is where the story truly begins, not with conflict, but with restraint, not with argument, but with everything left unsaid. Pressure rarely breaks people all at once. More often, it wears them down in ways that are almost invisible. It settles into the body before it ever becomes a thought, into the way shoulders tense during familiar conversations, into the quiet calculations made before speaking, into the small adjustments people make in order to keep peace. For Tabuchi, that pressure begins to show itself physically. His health issues are not dramatic, not sudden. They are the kind that arrive slowly, like a message the body sends when the mind has been carrying too much for too long. He grows tired more easily. Sleep no longer restores him the way it once did. And beneath it all is a persistent sense of inadequacy, not because anyone has accused him of failing, but because he has internalized the belief that he might be falling short. From a psychological perspective, this is what happens when responsibility becomes fused with identity. When a person starts to believe that their worth is measured by outcomes beyond their control, the nervous system stays in a constant state of alert. Tabuchi does not talk about this. He minimizes it. He tells himself that others have endured more, that silence is a form of strength. But silence, when prolonged, often becomes isolation. Riho senses the shift in him long before he acknowledges it himself. She notices how he withdraws into himself after family gatherings, how his gaze drifts when the topic of the future arises. Riho wants to protect him, yet she also carries her own quiet burden. She feels caught between loyalty and empathy, between honoring the family she married into and honoring the reality of the man she loves. Her internal conflict is subtle but relentless. She begins to question herself. Is she doing enough? Is her presence a comfort, or has she somehow become part of the problem? These are not rational questions, but they are deeply human ones. When expectations are unclear yet ever present, people often turn inward, searching for faults rather than naming the pressure itself. Riho decides to speak not in confrontation, but in hope. She approaches her father-in-law gently, choosing her words with care. She tries to express that some things in life cannot be scheduled or solved through will alone, that love and responsibility do not always follow the same timelines. But her words, though sincere, land against years of deeply rooted belief. He listens, he nods, and yet nothing truly shifts. She turns then to her mother-in-law, seeking understanding rather than solutions. And she finds it emotionally, at least. Compassion, shared silence, a recognition of the weight that tradition places on women in particular. But compassion, in families structured around hierarchy, does not always translate into change. What follows is not open conflict, but something quieter and more corrosive. Conversations become shorter. Topics are avoided. Riho and Tabuchi stop sharing certain thoughts, not because they distrust one another, but because each is trying to spare the other additional worry. This is a common mistake in close relationships. The belief that withholding truth is a form of protection. Psychologically, this is where connection begins to thin. Not through anger, but through over-adaptation. Each person bends a little more than they should. Each carries more than they admit. And in that effort to keep everything intact, something essential begins to slip away. Not love, but ease. By the time anyone notices the distance growing, it already feels familiar. And familiarity, even when painful, can be difficult to challenge. There is a moment in many families when tension reaches a point where it can no longer be managed through silence. Not because anyone raises their voice, but because the emotional weight becomes impossible to ignore. For Tabuchi and Riho, that moment does not arrive in the form of an argument. It arrives as exhaustion. Tabuchi's health falters further, not dramatically, but enough to make the fragility of his situation undeniable. For the first time, the future feels uncertain in a way that cannot be rationalized away. He finds himself confronting a fear he has avoided for years. The fear that he may never become the person he believes he is expected to be. Not a son who continues a legacy, but a son who protects his own well-being. The conflict is no longer external. It has become internal, and therefore far more difficult to escape. Riho reaches a quiet breaking point of her own, not one of despair, but of clarity. She realizes that her constant effort to maintain harmony has slowly eroded her sense of self. She has been listening so carefully to everyone else's expectations that she has lost contact with her own emotional truth. From a therapeutic perspective, this is a common realization. When people confuse peacekeeping with emotional health, they often sacrifice authenticity in the process. Riho speaks honestly to Tabuchi, not with urgency, but with steadiness. She names the distance between them. She admits her fear not of the future, but of losing the connection they once shared. For the first time, neither of them tries to soften the truth for the other. They simply allow it to exist. In parallel, the father faces his own reckoning. Watching his son struggle forces him to confront a reality he has resisted. That legacy is not preserved through pressure, but through relationship. He begins to recognize that his anxiety about the future has narrowed his vision of the present. His love has not disappeared, but it has been filtered through fear. This realization does not transform him overnight. Long-held beliefs rarely dissolve easily, but a shift begins. Subtle, internal, and deeply human. He starts to see that the continuation of a family is not defined by outcomes alone, but by the emotional climate that surrounds them. The climax of this story is quiet. There is no dramatic declaration, no sweeping resolution. Instead, there is a shared understanding that something has gone wrong, not because anyone intended harm, but because everyone has been trying too hard to live up to an idea rather than attend to the people in front of them. In this recognition, the characters are not freed from uncertainty, but they are freed from denial. And that, psychologically, is where meaningful change becomes possible. Stories like this resonate because they touch something many people recognize but rarely name. The tension between personal well-being and inherited expectation is not unique to one family or one culture. It is a quiet struggle that unfolds wherever love and duty coexist. And the lesson here is not about choosing one over the other, but about learning how to hold both without losing ourselves in the process. One of the most important takeaways from Tabuchi and Riho's story is the cost of silence. Another lesson lies in redefining responsibility. Ultimately, this story does not offer certainty or easy answers. What it offers is something quieter and more enduring: permission. Permission to question inherited beliefs. Permission to speak before distance becomes habit. Permission to define success not by expectation fulfilled, but by connection preserved. And in that permission, many people may find a path forward that feels not only responsible, but humane. If this story spoke to you, like the video and share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more psychology-driven stories about relationships, growth, and the quiet truths of everyday life.